Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with me today. We are going to be going over the media, as well as its relationship with democracy and how we can become better informed from consuming media content. However, I do want to focus on one thing in particular that will help us more safely and effectively consume that media content, and that is the concept of false balance, also known as false equivalency, or it's more broadly found in the fairness bias. I'm Mikey Edwards. This is my Com 418 final video project, a class taught by Dr. Seth Ashley at none other than Boise State University. Go Broncos. So, media and democracy. What kind of relationship do they have? Is it a peanut butter and jelly relationship or a perfect relationship? You just can't have one without the other. Everything's always great all the time. There's no problems at all. Or is it more like tacos and hot sauce, where a relationship that needs balance, or one where too much or too little can make some problems? Well, I'll be honest, I think it can be both sometimes. An honest, free press is something that always strengthens democracy. And Dr. Ashley, in his book, mentioned that a representative government requires an informed citizenry. The news or media content can help make that happen. We can become better informed about politics, about legislature, and we can vote more effectively because we're more informed. It's an important part of democracy. Also, media can not only help the public be more informed so it can better participate in democracy, it also can speak truth to power or act as a government watchdog. I think these are the situations where the media and democracy, they're peanut butter and jelly. It was meant to be, and it's working out great. However, sadly, in the modern age, the internet has made a serious impact on media content. For one, the amount of misinformation that's able to be easily spread has increased exponentially, both intentional and unintentional. Maybe your grandma shared that fake headline from The Onion and she thought it was real, and now it's spread all across Facebook and convincing certain people that a crazy news story actually happened. Or maybe it's a little more nefarious and people are just trying to convince people of things that aren't true. AI has also been a problem. Verma in 2023, in her article in the Washington Post, stated that fake articles created by AI have increased by over 1,000% in recent years. And I bet we all believe that. I bet we've seen it firsthand. Situations like this, where people can just spread any misinformation they want over social media, there's 1,000 different voices trying to get our attention at all times. I think that's a little too much hot sauce sometimes. So it's important that we focus on credible sources, sources that are telling us the truth, sources that are backed up by facts. And that's when media and democracy really do work well together. But I mentioned earlier that I really want to talk about false balance and the fairness bias. They're kind of the same thing. They're very closely connected. I would say that false balance is kind of contained within the concept of the fairness bias. But this is something that we should be more aware of when we consume media content because it can help us avoid being misinformed. So, according to Amundo and Rapp, false balance can occur when equal platform is given to opposing views, despite one view holding expert and evidentiary support. I know that's a lot of fancy words, but basically what it boils down to is sometimes the media can show a debate or an interview where they have two sides of an issue, and one side might be an accredited scientist with facts and evidence, and the other might be just some Joe Schmo who doesn't agree with this person. But when they debate, it kind of puts them on equal footing, so it gives unnecessary credibility and platform to the voice who's arguing against the more credible person. Sometimes it can happen. This can cause the public to believe that there's an ongoing debate about issues that really aren't ongoing debates, such as arguments about the Earth being flat. You might have one scientist who has satellite images of the Earth. They might have all this data proving that the Earth is round. And then you just have someone who is not a scientist, maybe they're self-employed, and they just say, hey, look, when I pour water on this lemon, it falls off, but when I pour water on this plate, it stays. The Earth is totally flat. You can see how platforming that person on a major news site might make them look more legit to some people, or it might get their word out to others who end up believing them when they really should have been shut down by the media pretty hard. Maybe the media should have been more clear saying, hey, we're going to let this debate happen, but before it starts, just know this person has these credentials and all this evidence. This person currently doesn't have any evidence or credentials. So just know that while you watch him. Or maybe even having a banner at the bottom, right? And the fairness bias, this just kind of is where false balance can stem from. This bias comes from a desire to pursue objectivity, which is a good thing, right? We want to hear both sides of an issue. We want to be fair, even if we agree with one side over the other. It's not a bad thing to give both sides a chance to talk, right? However, Dr. Ashley, in his book, also mentioned that the fairness bias reflects the both sides approach to news gathering, which can generate a false equivalence between unequal positions. This is very similar to what we talked about in a false balance, right? And sometimes a desire to be fair and cover both sides of an issue can give unnecessary credibility to a side that doesn't deserve it, right? Or maybe even get their platform shared to many people who end up believing them when their platform is known to be false or immoral. So, I want to share a real world example of when a fairness bias or a false balance caused people to believe something that wasn't true. This is the story of Fox News versus the movement Birds Aren't Real. Now, Birds Aren't Real, it's a satirical movement created by a young man named Peter McIndoe. I made sure to look up his name, how to pronounce it beforehand. But Peter McIndoe decided to create a satirical conspiracy theory that claims that all birds were killed by the government in the early 1900s and replaced with advanced robotic drones that spy on all of us. And when you see birds on power lines, it's because they're charging. And it's clearly a ridiculous concept, but people will get on marches, they'll hold signs, and they're just having a funny time because it's all satire. However, it has grown to a pretty big movement over the years, and Fox News in 2023 decided to interview the founder, Peter, about it. Now, it was Friday night, August 18th, 2023, and yes, that totally is Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. I was surprised too when I first watched this. I guess he used to work for Fox back in the day. And on the left, you see the founder of Birds Aren't Real, Peter McAdoo. I know it's spelled with an IN, but it was pronounced McAdoo in the interview. He says it's McAdoo, so I'm just going to trust him on this one. But this interview happened on Jesse Watters Prime Time in 2023, and Fox News treated it like a legit interview. They treated it like any other interview, even though they were, of course, very skeptical of all the things that Peter was saying, because Peter, he was in character the whole time. He was saying, hey, birds aren't real. If it flies, it spies. The government's out to get you. And he was saying all of his funny lines that he's practiced. But Fox News just treated it like any other interview, which almost made this movement seem like a more legit movement. And because they didn't point out that it was satire, a lot of people who watched this interview ended up believing that it was a legitimate movement with people who actually believed it. If you go on the YouTube video, you can see so many comments saying, I can't believe this Peter kid believes that birds aren't real, or I have no hope for the world anymore. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world don't believe that birds are real. Because Fox News framed this interview like any other and failed to mention directly that it was intended to be satire, tons of people became misinformed. They think that this is a real movement. It appears a little more credible in their eyes. And heaven forbid, maybe someone watching the interview agrees with a few things that Peter said, such as you can't trust the government. Maybe that person watching it thought, well, I don't trust the government. He doesn't trust the government. Maybe some of this stuff about birds not being real is true. And then he believes him. That could have happened. I really hope it didn't, and it probably didn't because it's such a ridiculous concept. But because they gave this interview the seriousness that it probably shouldn't have had, people ended up believing that it was a real movement, not a satirical movement. And people might have actually ended up believing maybe that birds aren't as real as we thought. So that's just one example of how a false balance can create problems. And now, more serious examples, there's been false balances on the news about climate change debates or about President Obama's birth certificate. So there's been things in the past that have been examples of a false balance, right? But in the end, Fox News didn't mention that this was satire, so people believed that it was real. Even though, just as a side note, Vice in 2022 did interview Peter, and he stated outright that it was satire. So a year before this happened, it was already public knowledge that birds aren't real was satire. But the framing of this interview maybe misinformed some people. So with that being said, I know we just talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, hot sauce, birds aren't real, Pete Hegseth. But the important thing is whenever we're consuming media content, we want to be aware of the potential for a false balance, or maybe that someone's falling into the trap of the fairness bias, right? When we read content, when we listen, or when we're watching a debate or an interview, pay close attention to what each side is saying. Is one side using more evidence while one side is simply sharing their opinion? Is one side accredited and has a lot of legitimate roles in that field, while one side doesn't and actually is not an expert in there? It's important to look at all of these things as a whole so we can tell maybe that there's a false balance going on. And if we do this when we're looking into interviews, debates, I think it's going to be easier for us to determine which side of the debate is presenting more facts, which side of the debate is more correct. It's just so important for us to pay attention whenever we're reading this news content, not just to passively read it and be shocked when we read things we disagree with and nod our heads when we read things we agree with. It's important to look for that fact, those facts and that evidence and just the credentials and legitimacy of each side. So, thank you so much for your time. I hope you're able to learn a little bit about false balances and the ways that that can make us misinformed when we're consuming media. I really hope that going forward, you're able to use some of these strategies to better consume media content, become a more informed citizen, and participate in democracy in a more effective way. Here's my references in case anyone wanted to look up that stuff for themselves. Thank you so much again for your time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or night.